Justice Law Review. And I want to welcome you to Whose Streets, Building Community Safety for All. Criminal Justice Law Review is a student-run journal here at UCLA School of Law. In addition to our annual publication each spring, we team up with UCLA's criminal justice program to host a symposium that brings together scholars, activists, and practitioners from across the country to discuss some of the most pressing issues facing the criminal legal system today. This year, we've added the UCLA Center for the Study of Women as a partner, and we're extremely grateful for their support. So huge thanks to them. I want to remind everyone that in addition to today's sessions, there are sessions the next 2 Mondays. And of course, we invite you to join us for those, and I'll drop the RSVP links for those sessions in the chat momentarily. With that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Criminal Justice Law Review Symposium Editor Kevin Shang, who has done a monumental job organizing this year's event. So, Kevin?
Thank you so much, Eric. Big thank you to Alicia and Eric for putting all this together. It's been a lot of emails, a lot of back and forth, and I'm just so glad that everybody's here now. I'm pleased to welcome everybody to the very first panel in a 3-part series, as Eric mentioned, about how we can rethink community safety and traditional policing. Our organizations chose this theme not only as a response to the events of this most recent summer, but also in consideration of long-standing tensions between police and communities of color. Now, as Eric said, we're very excited to bring together academics, activists, and policymakers to discuss 3 traditional spheres of safety: the street, the home, and schools. We hope that you'll join us next week as we discuss safety in homes and how we as communities can address incidents of domestic violence and assault. In today's panel, we have a fantastic lineup for you on safety in the streets. We want to explore how law enforcement's most visible interactions with communities, questioning how these interactions can be improved, and what functions can be taken on by members of the community instead. On our panel today, we have Farhang Heydari of the Policing Project at NYU School of Law, Ronda Goldfein of Safehouse, Philadelphia, the country's first safe injection site, and Michael Saavedra, an organizer with LA Youth Justice Coalition, who has worked to broker peace treaties in the streets. And moderating our panel today is UCLA School of Law's very own Professor Sunita Patel. During the event, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function to ask panelists questions at any time. We're going to reserve 15 minutes at the very end to pose these questions to our panelists. And with that, I turn it over to you, Professor Patel.
Thank you. Well, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the first of these 3 incredible sessions at the symposium and the journal has put together on emerging community-centered alternatives to policing. And our esteemed panel today will assist us in considering a few critical questions as calls to defund the police are taking hold across the country. What emerges in place of police? What formations can address harm without state intervention? Is there a role for police or government as we reimagine a society with alternative responses to harm? There are so many questions, and this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to get into in the next hour or so. So let me get us started by setting the stage and making sure we know exactly who's with us today. So if everyone can please just take a brief 2 minutes to tell us how you came to the work in your field and why you believe it's important for the moment that we're in today. And I'm going to go in the order of Michael, Farhang, and Ronda.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So for me, having been through the juvenile and adult prison system since the age of 14, I have witnessed firsthand the injustices and caste system that we as people of color get funneled into through the war on drugs, the war on gangs, and mass incarceration. The reason why I'm involved in this work also is because I want to mentor and inspire such people to seek higher education and become the real experts and leaders of change.
Hi, everyone. My name is Farhang. I'm from the Policing Project at NYU Law. Thank you, Kevin and Professor Patel, for inviting me here today. Michael, Rhonda, really honored to be sharing the stage with you both. So it's nice to meet you both. So briefly, how I come to the work. I became interested in criminal justice growing up in New York post 9/11 and seeing the police response to to that crisis led me to law school, where I really became, I started working on wrongful conviction cases, and that's what I did for several years after graduating. So had many clients who spent decades wrongfully imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. Really was my first exposure to seeing the criminal system, how it operated from the inside, how it tore apart families, both the people who were wrongfully convicted, but then also you see what crime does to families and communities. A few years ago, I was looking to make a change to get out in front of some of the things that I could see were wrong in the system. And so I decided to kind of move to the policy side of the work. And that's how I joined the Policing Project. At the Policing Project, our mission is to promote public safety through transparency, equity, and democratic engagement. And I just want to break down each piece of that I don't want to break it down, I just want to say it again slowly. So we promote public safety, and I think we're going to be talking a lot about that today, what exactly that means. And we do it through transparency, equity, and democratic engagement. And the most important part of that for me is the democratic engagement side. And I want to talk about this again more later, but when we look at policing and what's wrong with policing in the US today, and there's a long list, but the place we start with is a total lack of democratic accountability. And by that, I mean, we're government for the people, by the people, and policing should be that too. And everywhere we look, we see a lack of community voice, a lack of meaningful community input in setting priorities for policing and what the proper role of police should be in public safety. And we're working with communities of police around the country to try to change that. Thank you.
Rhonda?
I'm Ronda Goldfein. I run the AIDS Law Project of Pennsylvania, based in Philadelphia, which is the nation's only independent public interest law firm that provides free legal services to people living with HIV. We cover all of Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey, notwithstanding our name. And I've been doing that for a very long time, since I was a child, I think. The AIDS Law Project has had a long-standing affiliation with an organization in Philadelphia called Prevention Point, which is a syringe exchange. As a result of our connection there, we provide free legal services on site to Prevention Point's participants. In the beginning of 2018, when Philadelphia announced that they were interested in the concept of supervised consumption, supervised injection, our colleagues at Prevention Point said, can you help us do this? Can we get this off the ground? It's not yet off the ground. We think we will be first, but it's not yet off the ground. And we said, sure, how hard could it be? It's a great idea. It saves lives. Everyone loves that. So more to come on how that's playing out. And I just wanted to add, because it would be kind of conspicuous by the absence, I also chair Philadelphia's Police Advisory Commission, which is our city's civilian oversight. We are, like many commissions throughout the country, in the process of an overhaul, a long needed overhaul. And in fact, it's a ballot initiative in November. So I don't want to talk too much about that today, but just with the request that, check back next year and we'll see where we are on it.
Excellent. Well, I'm really excited to hear more about that at some other point, Rhonda. And I actually wanted to turn to you first to tell us a little bit more about United States versus Safehouse and describe the legal issues and the arguments that were presented. And I wonder if you can also put this in the framework of what we can anticipate in the future for challenges around harm reduction.
Of course. So as I said, Philadelphia, the officials in Philadelphia announced in 2018 that they wanted to consider a supervised injection site, that they looked at all the evidence and they thought it was a good idea. And we thought we would move forward with that. And the we in this instance is the AIDS Law Project and Prevention Point. And again, perhaps we were a bit naive. We thought, This is an evidence-based approach. There are more than 100 of them open. They've been open for 30 years. There's been no fatalities. Drug use is down, treatment is up, neighborhood improvement is up, public consumption is down. Who wouldn't like this? Who wouldn't want this? But in fact, the U.S. attorney didn't quite like it. And there was notably a piece in the New York Times from Rod Rosenstein saying, if you're going to do this, we're going to come and get you. But we pursued because we thought this is a thing we have to do. So in February of 2019, the U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania sued us. And while nobody likes to be sued, particularly by the government, we thought, okay, this is good. It calls the question. They sued us civil action for declaratory judgment, simply asking the court, is this activity lawful or not? We've consistently maintained that it was lawful and that it didn't violate the Controlled Substances Act. As some of you may know it as, there's a section, the crack house statute, which makes it illegal to maintain a premises where drugs will be used for the purpose of using, selling, storing, distributing drugs. And we said, that's okay. We're not doing any of that. We're maintaining a place that we can save people's lives. We can give them immediate health care. We can be a trusted source. We went into the argument with that idea. And by the fall of last year, although our days run together, a federal district court ruled that supervised consumption did not violate the federal law, that in fact our purpose was not to facilitate drug use, and that it was lawful in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. So we're thinking, okay, a third of the state, it's lawful there. We prepared to open a site. We were met with some community opposition, which we were prepared to weather, but COVID became more than we could weather. And the judge, in fact, the very judge who ruled that our activities was legal, granted the U.S. attorney's motion for a stay, saying that he still agreed that the activities were legal. He thought the public health data supported it, but he thought that Philadelphians were a bit frayed from COVID and demonstrations in the street, and he put us on hold. So right now we're waiting for our oral argument in the Third Circuit, which is going to be November 16th. And I can share a link. It's going to be live streamed, and we can all hear what happens next.
Thank you. Yes, please do share that link. That's going to be a really exciting and important argument. And so now I wanted to just turn to you, Michael. Can you talk a little bit? First of all, I think it would be helpful for you to introduce Youth Justice Coalition a little bit in your response as well. And can you talk a little bit about the peace treaties that you've worked on and what's necessary for brokering those kinds of arrangements and just the kinds of interventions that you've worked on? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So just a background about the Youth Justice Coalition. It was founded back in around 2010, I believe, which advocated for youth and decarcerating youth and stopping the school to prison pipeline, which was, hitting communities of color very, very hard. So the Youth Coalition is not only an advocacy organization, but also a high school in connection with Free LA High, which is part of the LA District Unified School District for kids or young people who are typically pushed out of traditional schools. So we are centered here at the Youth Justice Coalition. The Chuco's Justice Center in South Central Los Angeles. And if you Google it and Google the history of it, it was a former juvenile courthouse, right? So now we have this large building that also still serves as an exhibit and a reminder. We still have holding cells in the back where they used to keep youth waiting to go to their court hearings. And so the court hearings, the courtrooms themselves, we have changed into meeting rooms. And we also have the former district attorney and public defender's offices, which are now our offices. And we also provide space for other nonprofit organizations doing social justice work. So it's more of a community space now. We also do free legal clinics to the community every other Saturday, where we take on issues and questions or people who need assistance with tenants' rights, immigration, expungements, etc. So my, I guess you could say the way I came across the Youth Justice Coalition was, first of all, I have to give you a bit of my background. I spent 19 and a half years in California prisons, 15 of that in solitary confinement, based on false labeling of gang affiliation, etc. But during that time, I also began to become autodidactic and I taught myself the law. I never went to high school. I was kicked out and sent to juvenile hall during junior high. So while I was in solitary, I began to educate myself and also study and learn the law. And I ended up suing the Department of Corrections several times and winning a substantial settlement for due process violations for keeping me in there so long. But at the same time, other individuals were also advocating and pushing against the use of long-term solitary confinement for such reasons, which were based on racist, very racist procedures and evidence, such as having a tattoo of a dragon or a Aztec warrior or having a book by George Jackson. These type of things can cause you to be kept in solitary confinement indefinitely, meaning if you have life, you would be in there for life unless you either paroled, turned informant, or died. So solitary confinement has its own history of placing people who were, activists and organizers and leaders in the community in isolation in order to suppress their ability to communicate with the world and with other people, right? So in 2010, we all of us in solitary confinement came together and we're thinking about ideas of how do we fight back and resist against this. And as we all know, like similar things have happened in prisons, uprisings, like in Attica and other prisons, which ended very badly with a lot of people being killed and just, a lot of harm and not much change. And so we began to formulate ideas of how we can do this in a peaceful way, but also get attention from outside and bring attention to what's going on in here. And so the idea formed around doing a hunger strike. And so around in 2010, we went on one of the largest prisoner hunger strikes in this nation. There was up to, towards the end, it was around 20,000 prisoners had joined, both in solitary outside, as well as activists out here in the free world. And so, but in order for us to do something that grand on such a grand scale and have such an effect within the prison system, we had to first end all of the hostilities, tension, and violence that occurred amongst prisoners racially, right? Because as some people may know, unlike other states like New York and many other states, California segregates its prisoners by race. So it's the divide and conquer, right? And so they also use that against us when people begin to become nationalists and form, learn about their history, their roots, and also the segregation. People start organizing, becoming, politically aware of things. And so this is always used against us. And then there's a long history of racial tension and violence amongst Black and brown prisoners, right? And so in order to create this change and begin this hunger strike, we needed to all come together. And so folks, all of us inside began to form these dialogues and these conversations with Black, brown, northern, southern, white, everybody, right? Every race and faction to come together in solidarity and say, you know what, we need to do something. It's kind of like what Emiliano Zapata once said. He said, as individual fingers, we could be easily broken, but together we form a mighty fist, right? And so with that idea, we began to have negotiations or peace treaties, if you will, around ending all the hostilities amongst us and just completely becoming solidified, right? And so that led to the largest hunger strike ever. And then also folks like myself and other people who began to learn the law and litigate, a group of lawyers and activists took on our case as a class action. And in I would say around 2016, almost 90% of us were all released from solitary confinement. And the end of long-term solitary confinement also stopped, right? They can no longer keep people in solitary in California for no more than 2 years, which is still a long time, but compared to 15, 20, and some men even 30 years, it is progress, right? And so with that, coming home in 2017, I started going to school. One of the things that we were asking for while in solitary during the hunger strikes was higher education inside, because there was literally no type of education programs in solitary. And so I began to take some credits inside. And then when I came home, I immediately enrolled in community college. And I just recently graduated and was accepted to UCLA, where I'm beginning my undergrad studies.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so coming home after about a year of just doing school and other things, I had a bit of a moment in my life where, due to parole and other things, I was displaced and actually homeless. And so I had to begin to look for a job and living spaces. And I had friends through the formerly incarcerated student network at Cal State LA who introduced me to the Youth Justice Coalition, where they also worked. And so there was an attorney here who was the legal coordinator, but because of her student loans from UCLA Law School, she had to get a real job that paid more than what, nonprofits pay, right? And so that was an opportunity for me though as well, because she recommended me. I had been working with her, volunteering at their legal clinics, and I was hired by the Youth Justice Coalition to become the legal coordinator. And so during this time, which was around maybe a year and a half ago, our space was initially, we had another building in Inglewood, but due to eminent domain and the Metro link wanting to connect LAX with, of course, this new Rams stadium, which is complete gentrification of the community as well and displacement, our space was taken by eminent domain. And so we had to move here. The county offered us their old juvenile courthouse, which YJC also helped shut down, ironically, or I guess that's a great thing, right? And so we moved here. However, keeping in mind that we are also a high school, and the folks that work with us are also, heavily impacted by incarceration, community, etc. And some of those folks are from certain neighborhoods that don't get along with the neighborhoods where we're moving to. And it just so happened to be that also it was a racial divide and a lot of racial tension, hostility, and violence amongst Black and Brown in this community where we're going to move our new space to. And so, yes.
Michael, thank you. That's a perfect segue. Actually, I'm gonna follow up. I'm gonna bring you back, get us back to you so that you can talk about your current work as well. I'm just gonna have get Farhang into the conversation as well. So Farhang, sure. Can you talk a little bit about some of your primary interventions, alternatives to 911, and the front end policing briefly and introduce your work to everybody as well. Thank you.
Sure, that's a tough act to follow because I wanted to hear where Michael was going next. So the policing project, let me start by distinguishing two types of accountability. In policing, often you hear people call for greater accountability. Usually it's after we've had a person killed at the hands of police and there's cries for there's no accountability. And what folks tend to mean by that is the officers are rarely punished. There's not criminal prosecutions. There's rarely internal discipline. Lawsuits after the fact sometimes work, but is money really ever going to give a community justice or give a family justice? And so that's usually what you hear. you hear calls for. And we call that back-end accountability. I mean, it's incredibly important. It's what I did for years working on behalf of people who were wrongfully convicted. But there's another type of accountability, and it's the way we tend to think of accountability in most of government. It's that there should be rules in place before government officials act. We should know what the rules are. People should have a voice in setting those rules. And we call that front-end accountability. And front-end accountability doesn't really exist around policing. Actually, the Philadelphia Advisory Commission that Ronda was talking about is an example of it. They're not too common around the country. I mean, when you have a complaint about policing, or if you want to have your voice heard around what policing priorities should look like, where do you turn? It's not really an option. Mostly it's a paramilitary organization that sets the rules from on high, and the thousands of officers below carry them out. So at the Policing Project, our goal is focus on front-end accountability and think about what are the different ways where we can get community voice into the equation. Now, when I think about the parts of policing that I want to work on and I want to help bring front-end accountability to, I want to distinguish between proactive and reactive policing. And I know people have heard these terms, but I just want to level set a little bit. Proactive policing has gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. It's the idea that cops will go out and try to ferret out and deter crime before it happens. That's the logic that kind of undergirds stop and frisk in New York and the huge amounts of traffic stops that we see around the country. Police want to go out there, have their presence felt, deter crime before it ever happens. And we all know the problems with that. Huge racial disparities often result when police are proactively make stops. There's very little evidence that those stops do anything. I mean, the rates of finding weapons or deterring meaningful crime in New York during the stop and frisk period were almost none. We did a study in Nashville about the use of proactive traffic stops and found that it had almost no impact on crime. Tens of thousands of people still die on the road every year. So there's plenty of problems with proactive policing, but reactive policing doesn't get nearly as much attention. And it's one piece that we've been starting to work on lately. Millions, tens of millions of Americans call police services every year, usually through 911 or 311. They often bring police to their location because they're in some sort of crisis, or they see a problem, they need help, they don't know who else to call. And when police come to the location, all sorts of problems can result. And so the underlying problem, police they're only well suited to do a certain number of things. We train them on how to use force, how to use law, but yet we call them in all kinds of situations: homelessness, substance abuse, calls for mental illness. Those calls often go to police because we don't really have first responders that are willing and able to respond at any hour of the night to any kind of problem that people might have. And so when you bring people who are only trained really in force and law to dangerous situations, they're going to apply force and law to those situations. That's going to lead to unnecessary uses of force, and it's going to lead to a complete failure to address the underlying problems. And so we are starting to think through a project that we call Reimagining Dispatch and Response. So rethinking what does a dispatch system look like when people pick up the phone and need someone's help, but there are people other than police at the other end of that phone. What do we need to train the dispatchers to understand? What sort of resources do we need government or community groups to have to actually be able to respond? I mean, I think Michael's peace treaties kind of an amazing example, and we've seen other examples in other places in the country where you can actually call and with a violence-related problem and have someone other than a police officer show up. That's not common. People are just starting to work on those sorts of resources. But when we think about creating alternatives to 911 and reimagining dispatch, that's what we're thinking about, is how can we work with communities and redistribute societal resources so that it isn't just police that are the only responders to this range of problems.
Great, thank you so much. So I wanted to just take a step back, and all of you have hinted at part of this question, but I wonder if you could each just take a minute or two to tell me about what values and principles guide you as you're thinking about alternatives to law enforcement. And I think this is really useful in this space. We have a national audience. What do we need to be looking out for in terms of what will work? What are really actually going to embed some of the same problems that we see today? How do we think about those things? Rhonda, let me start with you.
I think that much of this is about harm reduction. You know, how do we accomplish the goals that we've set out to with the least amount of harm? How do we mitigate some of that harm that's happening in people's lives? And I think that with the supervised injection site, we were pretty clear, this is a public health issue. We don't need law enforcement for a public health issue. This should be completely separate. So when I was saying, well, who wouldn't like this? How could this go wrong? I was somewhat surprised at the vigor that the U.S. attorney, struck out at us. You know, that we heard these strong statements from the Department of Justice. We heard these strong statements from law enforcement in the area. And we thought, but this is an approach that works. This is a way to save lives. Why would law enforcement get in the way and prevent public health from happening?
So
definitely,
harm reduction, extremely important. Michael, what would you add to that?
sorry, I would definitely say in my work, I'm working with communities of color. So I think it's important to ground my principles in the community's needs and especially their culture.
Excellent. Farhang?
We're a national organization that actually doesn't do a ton of work in New York because there are plenty of organizations doing great work in New York already. And so when we go, we work with different communities around the country, the first thing that we try to ask is, what do you actually think the need is? I mean, it's kind of, I think it's kind of what Michael is saying is, every place has different problems. The crime problems are different. The social problems are different. The resource availability is different. And that's why we try to, our touchstone is democratic policing. So there is no one size solution for everyone. Another value I'd add here is, we have to talk about racial equity and all this. And I think the reason we have to talk about that is because law enforcement today it falls disparately on people of color in this country. That's not me saying that cops are racist. It's not me saying that police chiefs are racist or anything like that, but it's just a fact that law enforcement falls on communities of color in disparate ways. And so if we're coming up with solutions and interventions, we have to think about how do we promote equity in what we're doing.
So Michael, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about the work you're doing right now at YJC and some of the more contemporary work that you were getting to in your story, which was really incredible. Thank you.
Sure, I think an important piece that ties all of this into what some of the work that other folks here are doing is the alternatives to 911. So we do trainings here at Chuco's. We train the community in alternatives to calling 911 for every, and so we have professionals that come from the mental health field and others to create and also train, especially in domestic violence disputes, how to de-escalate situations where you don't always have to call the police. In small communities, everybody knows each other, especially in communities of color. And so, you can call somebody's tia or their mom to come, they'll listen to this person instead of, just calling the cops all the time. And usually that works. And then also the peace builders, which is an important thing, I think, in defunding the police, where at our high school, we don't have cops or security. We don't have people with weapons or anything. They're what we call peace builders. So these people are trained in de-escalation tactics, also how to know how to disarm people safely and, use their words and wisdom as opposed to force and violence. And it works. And we've also been establishing that and using people to do different events as peace builders for, as opposed to like security and armed law enforcement.
And Michael, can you talk a little bit about what it would take to scale up that kind of intervention?
Well, as we all know, money, it takes money, right? Because we definitely would need resources from both the state and even philanthropy, like grants, to do this type of work. Because what we really, in essence, want to do is we want people coming home, people that are connected, well respected, and you know, coming back to this work as such as I, with an eye on peace, solidarity, and making change in order to employ people as peace builders in the community or at these different type of you know, centers, but giving them livable wages so they don't have to go and do other things and they can survive and thrive off of a livable wage, which is probably way less than what the police get paid. And also, you know, forming that community bond and security and safety within the community itself.
Thank you. Rhonda, can I turn to you now to talk a little bit about the question of state involvement? I take it that the safe injection site, it does not involve the state. What would it take to scale up your model? And how do you see law and policy as a barrier to the work that you're doing?
Ideally, our model would have state involvement on the public health side, not the law enforcement, not the regulation side. You know, for us in Philadelphia, we're thinking about this is a group of committed citizens who thought we can do better by our brothers and sisters. We know how we can save their lives, and we want to do that. And so we don't need law enforcement involved in order to protect the public health. I think if we had state involvement on the public health side, then there can be some support for it. There would be some support in the neighborhoods. I mean, ideally, we want to be in a neighborhood. We want the neighborhood to thrive from it. We want to protect the people who are in the neighborhood. With public health resources, we can do all of those things. If we end up looking like a law enforcement model, it doesn't move the message forward that this is about healthcare, not crime. And it doesn't encourage people looking for treatment to go to that spot. And so we are perhaps less leery of the state because of our model, but very specific the support we'd like to see from the state.
Great. Farhang, can I ask you the same question in terms of nationally, what do you see as the obstacles, legal or otherwise, to kind of scale up some of these models that you're working on? And I wonder if you can also, in addition to that, take a minute to talk a little bit about the democratic engagement component of your work.
They're really hard questions. So what, you know, one of the challenges, I think one of the challenges with scaling up community-based response models is that, you know, is the challenge of keeping them community-based, if that makes any sense. You know, there's lots of what the model that works in one community may not work in another one. You need neighborhood organizations, you need neighborhood cohesion, you know, you need a community, like Michael was saying, where you can actually, where you do know each other and you can lean on someone. And so not every place has that. Not every place has the community organization infrastructure. So I think it requires investment. So I think that is one role of government that I see. Government has to, when we can rely on private philanthropy, or you can just hope that the money comes from somewhere, but I think it's kind of government's obligation to fund some of that. I mean, I guess I'm old fashioned. I think that public safety is still the job of government. It's just that it doesn't need to go about achieving it through law enforcement. So this is one way, is kind of investing in those communities. I also want to say a lot of the models that we've seen crop up, these are big city models with municipal funding behind them. There are a lot of cities in this country where, they're resource strapped. Maybe they'll be less resource strapped if they divest from certain institutions, but funding is going to be a problem in places. There's going to be rural communities where this is going to be a problem. I mean, there are rural communities where you call the police for animal control problems because they're just kind of the only responder out there. And rural small community incarceration rates sky. I mean, they're the only ones that are still going up. They're a third of our justice system. So we can't just think about solutions that only work for the New Yorks and the LAs and the Phillies of the world, right? There's got to be other answers. And you asked the second question, I think I've forgotten, but it also was hard.
I was just going to ask you to touch on the democracy pillar of your work for a moment. And I think that's maybe a bridge to the next question. I was going to ask each of you to just comment on how your work intersects with the national calls to defund the police, where you see things in tension with that movement, where you see yourself on the spectrum of reform and abolition. If you could just maybe comment about that a little bit, that would be great. And then I'll take a question from the chat.
So briefly on defund, abolition, those kind of questions. I feel like I first heard, I heard the defund conversations in June, and then I heard a lot of the well-meaning politicians' reactions to defund, and they started describing defund in a way that was different than I understood it. So let me back up for a second. The way I understand defund and abolition conversations to be linked, not so much that they are here's the exact 5 things that you need to do, but that they are a process and a framework for approaching public safety questions. And the way I understand it is, let's say you've got a social problem. How would you solve this social problem if law enforcement and punishment was not on the table, right? How would you go about using safe injection sites and community-based organizations to solve that problem if you couldn't turn to police and prisons? And that is, I think, like an abolitionist framework of answering these questions. And defund is tied to that. It's tied to smallering the scale of police. And then I hear a lot of, I think, well-meaning people who sympathize with the movement who kind of reshape it to mean, well, we should, police need better training on this issue and they need better training on that issue. I don't actually think that's what defund is about. I think defund would be very cautious about putting extra money into police training and putting extra money into body cams and things like that, because that is still money that's flowing into the police department budget. And so I think, that's just one distinction I want to make. One way our work overlaps a lot with those movements is, every cop I talk to will be the first person to say that I don't know how to respond to, like, I'm not the right person to be responding to calls for mental illness, mental health crisis and substance abuse. And so I think there is a lot of overlap, even with police and union officials and really just across the spectrum.
Michael, do you want to answer that question?
Sure. I think my work aligns very well with the current defund the police, defund the DA, prison abolition, etc. Given that it's work that divests from law enforcement, it's divesting from the prisons and jails, and investing in community and community resources.
Oh, sorry. I don't think we can hear you, Ronda.
Oh, is that better?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So our efforts actually predate the defund movement in that we built a model that was outside of law enforcement. We thought if we give folks who are using publicly in the street an opportunity to come inside, to get treatment, to have some non-judgmental assistance, then we don't have to call the police. We don't have to call the police when there's an overdose. We don't have to call the police when there's public consumption, and that we can create a better network of trust so that people will get the treatment that they're looking for. That bringing law enforcement into that tender balance doesn't really serve the participants or the communities.
Great. And I think that this question of what is meant by defund, what is meant by these different terminologies, really, really important. So thank you, Farhang, for kind of shedding some light to that. I wanted to ask now, and this is a question from our participants, in setting up police alternatives, what would the process look like to give alternative forces the same legal authority as police, to enter certain spaces and ask certain questions? This is a very interesting question. And I think it's a question of balancing who should do what, and also, I think the way we might think about it is, well, if we're trying to eliminate policing, police behavior, we don't just want to replace police with community members who are doing this sort of, criminalization, I guess is for a simple way of putting it. So how might we think about civilian and community-based methods that also allow for certain kinds of questions and of responding to certain settings? Does anybody, who wants to take that?
I could go first.
Sure.
So I think using a model of transformative justice and restorative justice where you still hold people accountable, and it's not necessarily having the law, like having the law back you up in doing transformative justice. It's more of, this is community, this is what we agree to do, and the folks that are in that circle are all accountable to each other. And I think it's a much better practice than law enforcement and locking people up and punishment, where the people that are harmed actually come away with healing, and as well as the person who does the harm being held accountable. And I've seen this in different aspects. It doesn't have to be necessarily the one that, is popular or whatever, but decided by the community.
And you use the word transformative justice. Can you just kind of help define that a little bit for everyone?
Sure. There's different models and there's different ideologies on it, but my experience has been within social justice. It's based on a lot of indigenous practices where people form this circle, and you have the person that was harmed there, and they get to bring in people for support, as well as the person that harmed that person. The community is holding that person accountable also, where they come into the circle and they have a person of support. And you also have like a community respected person who does the moderating, so to speak, right? And they get to ask each other questions, and which is you don't get to do in the criminal justice system. When they're punishing the person who was harmed, doesn't get to ask these questions, and that person doesn't feel free enough to answer honestly. And sometimes that's what people want for closure and for healing. And so that's pretty much the model that I have had experience, and I can relate to you guys as the meaning, so to speak.
Rhonda or Farhang? Yeah, go ahead, Farhang.
I was going to say, I think we actually want, I don't know if this is the question, but I think we don't want to give some of these alternatives the same powers we give police. And it's what you were saying about decriminalization. It's what Michael was saying about having, community accountability, but also I think a lot of the tension that comes from interactions comes from the possibility that, we know police have the power to use force. They have the power to arrest. They can look for open warrants. They can do, they can come in with a building inspector and actually search everything. And when they see something that they think might be criminal, they can seize it and you may never get the property back. And it is all those powers that we need, that we don't want coming to the table, because it amps up the tension of the interaction in a way that we don't want. And so if we have, let's say we're going to send civilians out to take crash reports in traffic accidents, which New Orleans is doing in some places. We didn't talk a lot about traffic yet, but in terms of justice on the streets, I mean, that is a big part of it. You don't want those people who are taking traffic reports to have arrest powers. I don't think you want them to be running warrants, because then the guy who has actually an open warrant because he hasn't paid his fines and fees might be more likely to flee and then hurt somebody in the car chase. It's that chain of events that I think we want to avoid setting off.
Right, and firearm authority or weapons authority, we don't want to give that authority broadly either. So Rhonda, did you have something to add?
And I want to say that the idea of bringing in some law enforcement or somebody who has similar authority kind of gets away from the point of what I'm focused on a lot about public health. And so that we're not trying to bring in some other judgmental entity. We're trying to say this is a safe space for you to get the health care that you need. In my day job at the AIDS Law Project, we do a lot of work around HIV criminalization, and the idea that you want to punish people around HIV instead of having open conversations about risk and benefit and how everyone keeps themselves safe is that's never a path that works, right? We know that people are gonna make better choices when they're able to do them, to accept them as choices and get the information they need.
And Rhonda, I wonder if you could also help us think about how to decouple public health from law enforcement, because there's a way in which, and maybe this isn't the case in Philly, but a lot of those entities around the country have co-responder programs within police and within the police agencies, or they have other specialized ways to share data and information. How do we think about making public health, and police?
I think we have conversations about what really works, right? The heavy hand of the law doesn't necessarily help people make better public health choices or advance public health. So we need to show where that works and how that works. I'm happy to say in Philadelphia, we have just seen that the police department will have a mental health specialist as part of dispatch. I mean, this was announced maybe 2 weeks ago, so we're all waiting to see how that unfolds. But we need to recognize that because you have a particular condition, whether it's you're struggling with substance use, you're living with HIV, that doesn't mean that that disease type becomes a crime issue. Nobody's calling the police if I'm not taking my insulin, right? And so we need to understand and be more respectful of the conditions that people are struggling with and recognize we don't need the heavy hand of law enforcement to ensure that people get some kind of model of treatment that they may not yet be ready for.
Right, because a lot of those efforts are really about regulating behavior and things that we think of as out of the norm of behaviors in society. So I wanted to ask another question from the chat. Can you, let's see, sorry. Okay. Can someone really get into the details of what it looks like to disarm someone safely, to intervene in a crisis on the street that's escalating? What would you do? What would you say? And not necessarily from your personal experience, if that's not the situation, but maybe from models that you know of or that you've helped implement. I know, Michael, you might have some firsthand experience as well.
Sure, I can briefly speak on that. You have to definitely assess the situation. Who is the person? What is the issue? People don't normally pull guns out on people unless there's something going on or something that happened to them, or they don't feel safe. And so I think understanding what these circumstances are and talking to the person first, it's always best to talk and de-escalate. And then of course, if you are close enough and you know how to grapple the person, you can safely remove the gun from them. But I do not recommend that for people that are not fully trained in martial arts and disarming people. It's always best to talk them out of it first as much as you can.
This question kind of sounds like it's asking, what does de-escalation mean? Like, what does it actually look like? Maybe, and I'm not an expert. I don't do this, but we write use of force policies for police departments, and so I at least know what the trainings look like for officers. In de-escalation training, they teach the use of positioning, distance, and cover to not, that's what de-escalation means. It's don't approach someone, it's don't approach with speed, don't put yourself in a position where you feel like you're gonna have to use more force. So it's kind of slowing down the situation and then using kind of what Michael was talking about, talking first and all of that. Not that I'm saying that police are the answer to this, but if the question is you're in a physical confrontation and you're a police officer, these are the kinds of things they teach you. It's why, so for example, Tamir Rice's case is just it is the opposite of everything you're taught to do as an officer to de-escalate. The idea that you would at speed come in a car, jump over a curb and within seconds be that close to someone who you think might be armed, that's the opposite of every tactic they teach you.
And just to add to that, I think that my models are always about starting from a farther back point. And so I would suggest that de-escalation may be easier if it's not led by a person in a uniform carrying a weapon who brings a history of abuse to a neighborhood. I think that just that point makes it more difficult.
Absolutely. I do a lot of work with veterans of the US military, and that's something that they talk about a lot in terms of their interaction with law enforcement, that they sort of can get back into a sort of combat mode because of the way it is when officers come in with these mental health units. It's the mental health team that's responding. It's the regular police that are responding. So it's actually, instead of 2 cop cars, it's 6. And so it's immediately sort of ups the ante, even though the purpose is to bring in mental health workers to help de-escalate. It actually sometimes can have the opposite effect. So I wanted to also ask, and this is sort of getting back, I think, into the nitty gritty. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about this. What kind of skills and training would you suggest for non-law enforcement around crisis intervention? And Rhonda, for you, in terms of managing the safe injection sites, what are we looking for?
We're looking at for somebody who can approach the participants in a non-judgmental way that really recognizes that if you're struggling with substance use, that's a problem, and that you're not going to approach it as, okay, you've committed a crime and now we have to respond to you as though you've committed a crime. That we're keeping all disease states on a common thread.
Great. Anyone else want to respond to that question? What kind of skills are we looking for? What kind of training?
Sorry, Sunita, the question was, what kind of skills and training are we looking for responding?
Non-law enforcement interventions to crisis management.
No, I let Michael answer that one.
Thank you. Again, de-escalation, how to disarm people safely if need be, as well as like mediation and transformative justice. I think it's really helpful too to have those circles where you can talk to people. Those type of trainings would help people in every aspect of life as well. So I think definitely those type of trainings that we are offering, and I would love to scale up on a countywide level.
Great. So we had a question that I think we will focus on more in the next symposium, but I wonder if someone could speak briefly to alternatives to 911 or 311 that focus specifically on intimate partner violence or gender-based violence. Farhang, I think that you might have some models that you can just sort of bring into the conversation.
I just want to say that this is a really complicated issue because oftentimes the calls, domestic violence calls, don't always even come in as domestic violence calls. Oftentimes they come in as noise complaints from neighbors. And so a lot of dispatchers, part of what we're doing is looking at dispatcher training and how they grade calls and what sort of officers they send to different calls. In certain places, noise complaints like that will get sent at a high priority because there's the fear that they are domestic violence issues. And so thinking about how we can train dispatchers to distinguish when they want to send police versus when they don't want to send police, how often police get there and it turns out it's more serious or less serious. There's actually just not a lot of good research on this. It's just a hard question that dispatchers are struggling with.
And Professor Patel, I know that you might have another engagement at this time, so I'm happy to take over at this time if you want.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Patel. And thank you so much for that last question and Farhang, for answering that. That's a good plug for next week's question, where we will speak more about safety, particularly in the home. In the last 15 minutes, we're just going to kind of round out the questions that have been submitted to the Q&A. One question that came up was that each of you had spoken about equity and justice in different communities, and I wanted to hear kind of each of your short answers on how you each ensure that what your solutions are doing are addressing the needs of the community, or that the community's voices are represented in your solutions. We could start with Rhonda.
So when we talk about supervised injection and communities, there's kind of a split within the community. And so we think about some neighborhoods in Philadelphia that are struggling with open air drug use. There's the community of those folks who are housed and don't want that in the neighborhood, and the community of those who are unhoused and are desperately looking for alternatives. And what we see is that law enforcement has come in heavily on the side of those housed. And it's not that we are not sympathetic to people who have kind of struggles and conflicts in their neighborhood, but I think that we need to recognize, like, all these people are living in the neighborhood, whether you're outside or you're inside, you're still living in that neighborhood. And we need to come up with solutions that are going to meet the needs of the community. And so again, for supervised injection, so people don't want to be injecting outside. They want to have some a path to treatment. We want to bring them outside, inside, and the people who are housed in their neighborhood say, we don't want to see them on the street doing that. We're like, great, and we have a plan for that. And so we just want the law enforcement to step back and allow us to create a plan that responds to the needs of this splintered community.
Thank you. Michael?
Definitely. I think in order to take on and tackle, disparities and racial inequities in this work and in the work that we want to do and push forward, I think it's definitely having those people most impacted at the lead and at the head of a lot of these organizations in the work itself, because those that are closest to the problems are also closest to the solutions. And I think that they are the experts, people who have that experience and knowledge and also have been harmed and oppressed by these issues. I think having them leading this work and a part of this work and being a part of those interventions as well as alternatives is very important. Having people of color involved and at the lead.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think, one of the problems with policing is, we can say we want community voices in the room, but what does the room even look like? There's not even a room where this is being decided. It's oftentimes the police chief decides to do something, or an officer gets sent over there and they exercise their discretion and do whatever it is they're going to do. There is not a lot of voice, period, when it comes to setting the rules around policing, let alone voices of particularly impacted communities. So one thing we advocate for is different kinds of mechanisms to give the public voice. I think civilian commissions are a good example of that. LA has one. It is a group of non-police officers who run the department. They have the ability to ask the department to do things, to request policies. Philadelphia is something similar. You have a lot of them on the West Coast. It is a stark contrast to what exists in New York. I know probably no one in LA thinks their system is perfect just to try to get any information out of, force any information out of NYPD. But that's something we try to do, is just create spaces for those voices to be heard, and then tools for those communities if they want to exercise them.
And staying on you, Farhang, another question that came up a few times, because you had mentioned addressing mental health with law enforcement. Are there best practices that you have seen in your work, or are there specific recommendations that you consistently make with regards to mental health and law enforcement?
So there's two different ways one could go about this. You could go we should give our officers more training route on these issues, or you could go it should be someone else responding to these calls route. And there are people who are doing both. On the training route, there's crisis intervention training, CIT training, there's a Memphis model of CIT training that people have studied a lot. And there's good data to suggest that even that it's a basic amount of training that allows officers to recognize this person is in some kind of mental health crisis, as opposed to, this person is dangerous for a different reason or belligerent on purpose. There is some sort of mental health crisis going on. I might want to call in more resources. That training model has shown pretty good results in terms of reducing use of force and leading to better outcomes. That's the train the police model. In terms of the go a different route model, there's people experimenting with that all over the country. I guess Philadelphia is going to have someone soon. Houston has a program that diverts calls to mental health responders. There's the Cahoots program out of Eugene, Oregon. Different city, Tucson has another one where they have a mental health center where officers are encouraged to get in touch with for those types of calls. So people are experimenting with these around the country. I think we need more investment. We need more research on all of them. So we need to try more things, and we need to know what works and what doesn't.
Kind of on that subject of trying new things, because the general theme that I kind of see from all the Q&As is people want answers in terms of what does work, what do we know works, what are we trying now? But I think people just want answers of, it seems like there's a solution out, but now the conversation is kind of more going. So going to you, Rhonda, has there been any impact of how international models of safe injection sites have impacted safety in other countries that has informed the work that you do now at Safehouse at all? Has there been influence from that?
Absolutely. The research around supervised injection is clear. It decreases public consumption. It decreases drug paraphernalia in the streets. It improves community lives. It decreases overdoses in the vicinity. And so we look at all those models and we say, this stuff works. Let's just, implement that model in Philadelphia, in the US. We don't have any reason why there isn't a supervised injection site in the US, right? It works. And it's simply because there's a federal law and part of a failed crackdown on drugs, not to go too far afield, but we call it for what it is. The federal law says you can't do it because we wanted to stop drug use in different ways. And as a result, we punish everyone who's struggling with drug use.
Thank you, Rhonda. Another question from the Q&A. This one seems to be more of a response to what Farhang had just said about the LA Sheriff Civilian Oversight Commission being ineffective. This kind of seems to go towards people wanting answers, wanting to know what actually does or does not work. Do any of the panelists have thoughts? Rhonda, serving on a panel yourself, you said check back in a year's time. Just kind of taking the temperature on the room on civilian oversight commissions. How new is this? How effective do we think they can be? I guess starting with Rhonda, and then we'll go around.
Okay. So, check back in 2021, and I think that the bottom line on civilian oversight is that it has to be transparent, there has to be access to information, and there has to be some level of enforcement and cooperation. Without any of those things, you end up just spinning your wheels, and you end up kind of like we are in Philadelphia, irritating everybody. Right? You don't get enough done because you don't have the authority to do it. And then you're still irritating the police because they find that you're bothering them by asking them the information they're required to give you. So I'm hoping that when the ballot initiative passes in Philadelphia in November, and in January, we restructure the commission, we'll have all of those elements built in.
Farhang, and then we can go to you, Michael.
I want to distinguish between two types of oversight, right? There's the oversight that tries to investigate cops who've engaged in misconduct and recommend punishment or fire them. I think that there's a very mixed record, and I'm being generous, of those managing to do just about anything. And most of them don't have the authority to do anything. They don't get the right documents. They don't see the body camera footage. They don't get to talk to the officers because of terms in the union contract or because of law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. They're just not really set up to succeed. And so it's hard to it's hard to say that they've been successful. There's another type of oversight structure, which is more front end, set policies, gather information. Some can hire and fire the police chief. They can force transparency in the department. I think they have better records of achieving change. But I kind of want to make a more fundamental point about them. I don't think that civilian oversight structures are the answer to a lot of the questions we've been talking about now. They don't address defund, they don't do that sort of thing. But this is a democracy, right? We need to have some voice in police departments and setting policing priorities. I mean, I don't think just because they haven't been successful thus far or haven't been as successful as we want that we should say, all right, we're going to turn over the keys to the department. I also don't think the solution is we're going to blow it all up. As much as some people may want to do that, that's not a solution that's going to pass through the majority of just about any city. I mean, we're seeing even Minneapolis, where it all started, is walking back statements about defunding the police and eliminating the police department. So I think we're looking for solutions that can have a wide range of support. And I think democratizing policing might be one of those.
Michael?
I think in a sense, I'm a bit more radical because of what I've been through and what I've been witnessing right now currently in LA and other states with the uprising and people just becoming, really clear on what needs to be changed. And I think people are really tired of reforms that have not worked. We've tried training, let's do more training, body cams, commission oversights. And all these things have failed us because inherently the whole system is broken and racist. And therefore, the whole system itself has to change from court to even, the police departments, etc. And I don't think these reforms are going to do anything to change. I think we need to think more radical and not in the sense of blowing stuff up or, abolishing everything, more in the sense of having community more involved in these processes and in these changes, as opposed to letting legislators and funders and other people with different agendas, political agendas, dictate or put on the agenda what we're going to vote for or not vote for.
And I just want to be aware of the time. So if I could just pose a quick question to each of you on, I think our audience is primarily law students who all care about community safety to some degree, and you're all very experienced in each of your fields. If we do want to get more involved with anything that you're doing, any recommendations that you would have to a current law student or soon to be law student, or just anyone that's tuning in who wants to work on these types of fields, any recommendations that you have, starting with Rhonda?
I would encourage folks to check out your local harm reduction organizations. I mean, I think that that's where lawyers and law students with some legal reasoning can figure out how can you build a model that's going to stay within the law, as long as we have the law, but still be able to provide the greatest good to the community.
Farhang?
Yeah, I think lawyers can play a good supportive role in community movements, and so I think finding what that local movement is and supporting it, I think that's the way to go.
I agree with both panelists, and also, joining some of the work that's already being done in here in LA, like the LA Justice LA Coalition, right? That's been doing the work on alternatives to incarceration, closing down men's central jail, etc., defunding and divesting rather, and investing in community, and also joining some of our workshops like the alternatives to 911 and learning and bringing new ideas to the table, as well as volunteering for some of our legal clinics and helping folks in the community to make this change.
Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists and all the attendees for coming to this event. Super interesting discussion. Obviously, wish we could keep on talking about it for more, but I just want to do a quick plug for next week's event as well. Some of the questions involved: how do we answer domestic violence, safety in the home? We'll be answering those topics next week, but thank you so much for coming today. Hope you have a good rest of your week, and thank you again to our panelists. And in the link there we have who we have, but thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.